Welcome to our discussion of the Great Depression in the 1930s and then U.S. involvement in World War II, with a focus, of course, on Texas. And this lecture, because of its length, is divided into two parts. The first part will focus on the Great Depression. I won't go into great detail on the causes for the Great Economic Depression. Many economists attribute it to the great bull market in stocks that began in 1924. A bull market is a market with rising prices. It just seemed to virtually everyone that the stock market was going to continue forever, and it was a quick way to make money and an easy way to make money. And there was a lot of buying on margin, which means buying with credit. So someone, let's say they wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, they would use $25 or $30 of their own cash, borrow the remainder, and many people were willing to lend the money on the assumption that the person could sell that stock, let's say in a year or 2 years, for significantly more money, and then pay back the loan. But also, as we look back on the late 1920s, consumer spending was not increasing rapidly enough. We saw in a previous lecture how the 1920s were characterized by a huge increase in consumer demand, purchases, particularly by households, of many new electrical products, radios, cars, etc. But it was not increasing enough to keep up with the output from the factories. And it was what is normally referred to as a classic bubble market. People had assumed it would last forever. And then in September 1929, that bubble was burst, and the stock market had its first major decline. This led to many depressions, people who had put all their money into stocks, and overnight, depending on the stocks they'd invested in, they'd lost so much money. But it's important to recognize that the stock market crash on that one day in fall of 1929 did not cause the depression. It was rather a symptom, and it showed that the prosperity in the 1920s was based on very weak foundations. And one example of that was there was a similar bubble in Florida real estate on the assumption that wealthy New Yorkers and others in the northern part of the United States would continue to flock to Florida to buy seaside properties to escape the cold in the north. But that speculative bubble in real estate burst in 1924. Well, the stock market crash in 1929 led to a run on banks in which everybody went to their banks to try and get their money out. Obviously, the banks didn't have the money in the bank itself, because banks don't just keep money in their safes. They lend out virtually all of it in the form of loans, and that's how they make the money to pay interest to the depositors. So this led to runs, and then banks had to close their doors. And looking back also at 1929, the actual economic recession began quite a number of months before the September crash. As I mentioned before, most economists now say that the basic problem is there was overproduction and underconsumption by consumers. An important factor in the lack of consumption of the products being produced was that the European economies had recovered in the late 1920s and no longer needed to import so many U.S. products, because after the destruction of World War I, it took several years for the European economies, particularly those in France, Germany, and Britain, to recover. And during that period of time, the United States had exported many, many industrial products. Well, this is a cartoon from the time of the stock market, depicted as a roller coaster that while it had traditionally ups and downs, it was generally on an upward trend. And then all of a sudden, you're on the roller coaster and it just goes down. And this cartoon was published in 1929. Of course, it did not go to zero. This is a photo of a typical run on a bank where people stand in line all night hoping they can get their money out. This is a famous photo. It's one of the iconic photos of the Depression. This wealthy man selling his latest automobile. $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. By 1932, there was 25% unemployment in the United States, and there were many, many more people who were underemployed in the sense that because of the economic conditions, they had left professional jobs and gone into lower level jobs where they earned less money. Now, over the 4-year period from 1929, the stock market crash, until 1933, the gross domestic product of the national economy fell by over 1/4, at 27% to be exact. The economy during this period from 1929 to 1933 was also hurt. It was already in decline by reducing foreign trade. And this was, the most famous was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, which imposed huge tariffs on imports. The assumption being, well, with what money consumers have, they should buy American products rather than foreign products that will help American factories maintain production and maintain workers. The problem with that is other countries immediately retaliated, and so Americans could no longer ship nearly as many exports. And this is called typically the beggar thy neighbor policy, and this is always an issue in international trade negotiations. And the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, also reduced the money supply with a tight monetary policy. And most economists today would say that this is exactly the opposite of what should have been done. There should have been a loosening of the money supply rather than tightening it. This graph shows the unemployment rate in the United States from 1930 to 2008. And you can see in 1930, the area that's shaded on the left, the average is 17%. It peaked, you can see it over 25% at one point, and then came down. And it dropped very low, looking ahead in the early 1940s. And of course, this is World War II. And then since then, it's, normally 5, 6, 7%. And most economists would say that's about as low as it normally gets because of what's called structural unemployment. People have just left school, they don't have a job for a while, or people are between jobs. So nobody ever expects it to go down to zero. Now, the Depression had a huge, huge human toll, and that really can't be captured by just looking at statistics and graphs. Fully 1/4 of people couldn't afford housing or adequate food, and 40% of home mortgages were in default, and many, many farmers became bankrupt with the low prices for their products. It's simply the prices for their products, both crops and animal products such as meat or milk, were lower than the cost of production. It led quite understandably to great despair by people. Some people just sort of gave up. I already mentioned some people committed suicide. And a response was 1% of Americans officially joined the Communist Party. This is by far the highest number in the United States that have ever been members of the Communist Party. There were soup kitchens all across the United States, particularly with private organizations such as churches providing soup. And people went out on the corner to sell apples to make a few cents. And people took to the roads, they were called hobos, took to the roads to search for jobs somewhere, or they would jump onto freight trains to move from city to city. This is a view of a former middle-class person, and this man is sitting there reading a newspaper, and he has built a little shelter in a public park. Here we have a man, you can see well-dressed. He says, unemployed, buy apples, 5 cents each. And you can see the women there buying some apples. And you can see, by the way, that many of them have maintained the hairstyle of the 1920s with the shorter hair. Now you might ask, why sell apples? Well, it's interesting. There was a bumper crop. A bumper crop is an unusually large crop of apples by coincidence in Washington State. So the growers thought, oh, here's a great opportunity for us to sell our apples. So they suggested people stand around the U.S., stand on street corners and sell apples. It's an example of clever marketing by the apple growers. Now, here in Texas, most Texans, like most other Americans, were not themselves really vulnerable to these risky stock market investments. Most people were not borrowing huge sums of money to invest in stocks. So at first, they read about this, they thought, oh, these are the other people, these are particularly the Texans thought these are the people up north. However, the stock market continued a steady decline for about 4 years after the 1929 crash. But again, most Texans did not directly own stocks themselves, so they were not directly impacted. Of course, they were indirectly impacted by this, as the stock market decline led to a decline in the overall economy of the United States, and then they were directly affected by that. As for agriculture, the agricultural sector didn't immediately decline after the stock market crash, but then it did fairly quickly over the course of the Depression. And in fact, most Texans thought that Texas, which was based on agriculture and oil, would be safe. And also, Texas had many regional financial institutions that generally weren't large New York and other state banks in Texas. And so many people in Texas said, well, the pain of this recession will be up in the Northeast, and that will be among the investors. And, anyway, they're investing in non-productive activities like investing in the stock market. However, even though they didn't own stocks, Texans became impacted very quickly. There was unemployment in the urban areas, and that led to declining demand not only for industrial products, but also for food. And it reached the point where the prices paid to the farmers was less than their cost of production. And so within a year of the stock market crash, sort of by the summer of 1930, the Depression had really hit Texas. There was some relief, particularly in East Texas, by new oil finds, and so many people flocked to towns there to get jobs. However, it wasn't enough to offset the losses in the rest of the state. But then because of the general decline in the economy, the price of oil really plummeted from about $1 a barrel to 8 cents. And the barrel itself costs more than that to produce. So there were a lot of people who had no employment opportunities in the state, in agriculture, in construction, or working as laborers in the cities. And the net result was unemployment rose in Texas. Now, over the decade of the 1930s, the value of farms and of livestock declined. The number of acres under cotton cultivation declined, and the number of factories all declined. And about 300,000 Texans, that's about 1/3 Texans, could find no private employment. And we'll talk in a few minutes about federal programs to provide some sort of work for these type of people and give them some income. As I mentioned before, the oil sector did provide some offsetting balance, and that's a misprint. It shouldn't be 250,000 million jobs. It should be 250,000 jobs were created in the oil sector. Now, compounding all of this, we have the phenomenon of the Dust Bowl in the south central part of the United States, including very much Texas. The early 1930s was a terrible drought in a number of states: Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And this drought lasted a number of years. And so what happened is the crops obviously couldn't grow. Very few farmers had artificial irrigation. And there are naturally strong winds on the central plains, and it started to blow the dirt off, producing huge dust storms. This map shows the worst hit areas during the dust storms, or the Dust Bowl, they called it. You can see Texas there was impacted, particularly the Panhandle region, which is in red, and the yellow areas were also severely damaged by lack of rain. Well, the result is, in these impacted areas, many people couldn't pay their mortgages on the farms to the banks. The banks took over the farms. Of course, the banks had no one to sell the farms to, because nobody wanted to buy an old farmhouse with very little dirt around it, because much of the dirt had blown away. So millions and millions of farmers left their farms and headed largely to California to look for work. And these people were called Okies if they were from Oklahoma, or Arkies if they were from Arkansas. And this was a derogatory term applied to them by the people in California when they all arrived in California looking for work. Of course, California had been hit also by the Great Depression, so they were not particularly pleased, the workers in California, to see this flood of workers from the Dust Bowl states. John Steinbeck wrote the famous novel Grapes of Wrath during this period of time, and you may have read it in another course. This is a picture of a car with farmers on their way to California. And you can see they have all their possessions there tied to the car. Now, John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, was made into a movie, a highly successful movie, just a year or two after the book came out. And actually, the movie was very, very popular in the United States. But during the Cold War in the 1950s, the Soviet Union wanted to show the the Soviet workers, how poorly treated the workers were in a capitalist country like the United States. So they had free showings of the movie The Grapes of Wrath, which was supposed to show the great poverty under capitalism. Well, this effort totally failed because the workers walked out and said, wow, look at this. Even the poorest people in the United States have cars that they get into to drive off and find more work. This is a photo of a dust storm in Amarillo, up in the Texas Panhandle in 1936. You can see the wind there, and you can see on the telephone pole running down the right side there, the signs are blowing in the wind. Those are metal signs blowing in the wind. And this photo was taken in the middle of the day. You can see the dust everywhere. And rainfall in the Panhandle area between 1928 and 1940 reached its annual average only 3 times. So this was a very, very prolonged drought. Well, like everywhere else in the U.S., early on in the Depression, many Texans hoped it would end quickly, and they thought, well, all we have to do is return to our tradition or maintain our traditional values, thrift, but we don't need to buy so much for the home. We could buy less expensive food, and we can continue to be productive. And they thought, well, maybe some people thought maybe this isn't so bad because there was just too much consumerism in the 1920s. Now, President Herbert Hoover, a Republican president, was elected in 1928 when the country was still very, very prosperous. And about a year after he was elected, of course, the stock market crashed. But he personally came to symbolize an uncaring government because it happened on his watch. And President Hoover was a very serious engineer. He wasn't really a career politician. And he did not speak very well. And of course, now we have the radio, and whenever people heard his speeches, they said to themselves, well, this man doesn't care, just listen to him. It's not, entirely fair criticism of him, since at this time there was a global recession, not caused by Herbert Hoover. And Hoover, in fact, took a number of significant steps early on to try and fight the economic depression. And in fact, he did much more than any other president in American history had done when faced with economic depressions. There were often periodic economic depressions. It turned out the one in the 1930s was the worst in U.S. history. But Hoover had actually, right after World War I, been sent to Europe by the Democratic president Woodrow Wilson to manage this massive relief effort in Europe, because there were people literally on the verge of starvation in Europe. And he went there, and everybody acknowledged him as having done a wonderful job in Europe of managing the distribution of all the relief, particularly food that was flowing in. But this happened on his watch, the stock market crash, and people said, well, we're doing the traditional things, but it's not enough. So there were people literally sleeping under newspapers. They'd be in little shacks. We saw a photo a few minutes ago of someone in a public park. And people started calling those newspapers their Hoover blankets as a criticism of Herbert Hoover. The areas where they had a lot of shacks together, they call those Hoovervilles. Again, a reference to Hoover. And here in Texas, people would, hunt rabbits to eat, or even armadillos, which aren't a traditional food. And they started calling them Hoover hogs and because people were used to having pork, and so now they're eating rabbits and armadillos. Now, across the United States, and also in Texas, but politicians, both Herbert Hoover at the national level and at the state and local level, people tried the characteristic response to previous economic depressions, and that was not sufficient. And this response consisted largely of charities like churches, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, providing blankets, providing shelter, serving free meals, but it just was not sufficient. Well, in Texas, there were more and more demands that the government do something, the state government, and there was a very lively primary election in the 1930 governor's race. And in fact, there were 11 candidates, and Ma Ferguson again ran herself. But Houston oil executive Ross Sterling also ran, and he proposed issuing bonds of up to $300 million to pay for construction jobs in the state that would create jobs. Well, in the primary election, Ma Ferguson came in first among the 11 candidates, but in the runoff election, Sterling won by a very, very small margin. Well, Sterling went to the state legislature with his idea for selling bonds and using that money to provide employment to people, but the state legislature rejected it. And he also tried to raise taxes, and the legislature rejected it. So he had to keep state expenses as a minimum, and he just came out blaming confidence for the economic decline. He said, well, people just have to have traditional confidence, and the economy will get better. Now, 2 years later, Ma Ferguson again challenged Sterling, this time in the 1932 primary. And she said the state government should take a greater role. The traditional private sector and charitable efforts simply aren't working. And Ferguson won 62% of the vote in the general election. But it's interesting to note that that was much lower than the percentage that Franklin Delano Roosevelt received when he ran to be president in the 1932 election. Roosevelt received 89% of the Texas vote, an incredibly high percentage, 89%. And what it showed was, there are reservations in Texas about returning the Fergusons to the governorship, because, of course, it wouldn't just be Ma Ferguson returning as governor, but her husband, Pa Ferguson, would of course be the actual governor. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR, was campaigning to be president, he promised that he would have a new deal for the American people, a new deal. And his vice presidential candidate and later vice president was from Texas, John Garner, who was very influential over the course of the 1930s with the various New Deal programs. We'll talk just about a few of them in this lecture. This is a political cartoon from the time showing Roosevelt's New Deal. And here the word deal is being used in the context of playing cards, where you deal out the cards and you hold some in your hand. And what you have in the hand here, and this is the hand of the U.S. government. You can see on the sleeve the stars of the U.S. government. You have things like a budget message, bank holiday, protection of gold. Now, after Roosevelt became president, with Congress's support and the Congress in Washington was dominated by Republicans in both the House and the Senate. You had a creation of a large number of new federal programs. One of them, the Public Works Administration, spent $110 million in Texas on 992 projects, which is almost 1,000 projects, that created jobs, but only for skilled construction workers. These were jobs like building bridges, where they obviously need someone with some construction skills to work on that project. Well, this provided employment to the workers, and it also, in the long term, provided the state with a lot of infrastructure development, such as bridges and schools, many of which exist to this very day. Another one of the many agencies set up was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. These agencies were generally known by their initials, and this was actually managed by the War Department. The Department of Defense was later created, but at this time it was called the War Department. And they ran these camps like military bases. And the idea was to take unemployed men and have them work in the national forests, the parks, the recreational areas. And they said they were soil soldiers because they'd be out, like soldiers, but working with the soil. It only employed men, and blacks and Indians were in segregated facilities, even though the law itself had said there would be no segregation. In practice, not only in Texas, but in many states, there was a segregation. They only brought in single men, and the men received 15% of their income in cash. The other 85% was sent back to their families. So the idea was you give the man a job, it's giving him food, something to do, and a great emphasis at this time was on maintaining the work ethic of the American people, not just to give out the money. So you have these projects that, were not absolutely crucial to the economy of the United States, to build a hiking trail like the Appalachian Trail in the eastern part of the United States. That's not really essential to get the economy going, but it was really felt that you don't want people sitting at home and just giving them money if they're physically able to work. And so this is a poster at the time encouraging people to apply to the Civilian Conservation Corps, a young man's opportunity. And it says down below, for work, play, study, and health. Well, I don't know how much play there was being in a camp organized by the military. You'd certainly go out and work. And, the applications were taken. This is from the state of Illinois. And in Texas, the Civilian Conservation Corps had about 50,000 men between the ages of 17 and 25. And they were working on all sorts of things. I remember a few years ago, I was in San Antonio, and many of you may have been there. Very near the Alamo, there's the River Walk. It's an area with a small river on both sides. There are all kinds of restaurants. It's a nice place to go when you're in San Antonio. And there are little bridges, small pedestrian bridges, crossing the very small river. It's almost like a canal. And I was walking up one, and I noticed a big plaque, and it said that it had been constructed in 1933 or 1934 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And here it is almost 100 years later, and that little footbridge is still being used. There were 24 of these military-style camps set up in Texas, and this is a photograph of one of them. Another one of the major agencies set up was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this was known as the AAA. And this paid farmers money to to destroy crops. I mean, if they had cotton already in production, just plow it under and limit hog and dairy products. So they still have to milk the cows, but just throw the milk away. The idea was limiting production would increase the prices. And the next year, they paid people not to plant the seeds, just leave the field, most of the fields, not all of them, of course, most of them empty. And this is classic, economics 101, supply and demand. And by reducing the supply of these products, the hope was the prices would go up. Well, prices started to go up, but then just as they were going up, the Dust Bowl became more and more severe, particularly in Texas at that time. And yet another agency was the Rural Electrification Act. And the idea was to provide low-interest loans to provide electricity to isolated farmers. Well, there weren't really enough. The farmers were spread out, not only in Texas, but often in other states, but particularly in Texas because geographically it's such a huge state. And it wasn't profitable economically for a private company to put up the electric poles and provide electric service to a farmhouse that's 3 miles away from anyone else. So this act provided loans to cooperative groups of farmers in an area would get together, and they would then take this money and encourage a company to come in to provide electricity. And this was really needed because in 1935, and this is hard to believe, in 1935, only 2% of the farms in Texas had electricity. And this is, just a few years before World War II. And many of those farms actually didn't get electricity until after World War II or the 1950s. Now, as governor, Ma Ferguson proposed having greater income for the state so the state could do more, because you'll recall during the campaign she had promised that the state would do more. Well, she proposed either having an income tax or a sales tax, and both of those ideas were quickly rejected by the legislature. She also said, well, maybe we could consolidate the state agencies, that would make us more efficient, or the state colleges, but the state legislature did not agree. Well, in 1934, Ma Ferguson decided not to run because the tradition in Texas had been a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. So James Allred succeeded Ferguson as the Democratic governor, and he was reelected in 1936. Also facing opposition from the state legislature to any new taxes, he wasn't really able to establish any significant state programs to help the economy. He did, however, establish the Department of Public Safety, which we still have today, DPS, and that brought together a lot of law enforcement agencies like the Texas Highway Patrol, and particularly brought in the Texas Rangers, who had been used in the past often for some questionable political activities. Now, on the national level, Congress approved the establishment of the Social Security system, which of course we still have today. And in fact, about 1/4 of the federal government expenses every year are related to Social Security. So they started collecting taxes beginning in 1937. These are payroll taxes. So if you've had a job, you've noticed that there's a deduction always from your income, and one of those deductions is Social Security. It's called Old Age Survivors Insurance. It's about 6%, and the idea is you pay in while you work, and then you're entitled to a pension based on how many years you worked. Well, That was set up in 1936, 1937. They started collecting tax, and they only started making payments to people in 1940, people who had then reached the age of 65. Well, there was a separate program set up, which Texas took advantage of, because they realized that this was a new program. It would take a while for people, younger workers, to be eligible. So the federal government matched state funds, and Texas set up an old age pension scheme that actually started issuing checks to elderly people in 1936. This is a poster in the 1930s that was advertising how the Social Security system works and encouraging people to get a Social Security number, which they could then use so their deductions from their paycheck are properly credited. Well, overall, most Texans strongly supported the New Deal, and Texans joined other Americans in re-electing Roosevelt in 1936 for a second term of office. Now, shortly after that, there were many conservative Democrats, not just in Texas, but throughout the country, and Republicans who strongly opposed Roosevelt's effort to, quote, pack the Supreme Court. And what this was a not very well thought out scheme by Roosevelt to change the composition or the political orientation of the justices on the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court had started to vote against some of his major rule against his major programs on the grounds they weren't constitutional. And many of those 9 justices on the Supreme Court had been appointed in the 1920s by conservative presidents. So Roosevelt made a major mistake by not even consulting his closest advisors in the White House, nor did he even talk to the leaders of his own party in Congress, but he just came out one day and announced that he was going to ask Congress to change the law so that there would be a new justice or judge appointed to the Supreme Court for every justice over the age of 70. And he argued that, well, we all know that anyone over the age of 70 is not as productive as when they were younger, so we need to help them out. Well, since most of the Supreme Court justices were over the age of 70, this meant effectively that Roosevelt would have packed the court with his political choices, because he, as president, would send nominations to the Senate, which was controlled by Democrats. And of course, those would have been Democratic supporters of Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt's own party was absolutely shocked by this scheme, and they were insulted they hadn't been consulted beforehand. But many said, well, this is violating the Constitution, even though the Constitution doesn't specify the number of Supreme Court justices, or this is destroying the structure of the federal government for your own political ends. And so, needless to say, his plan got nowhere. Also, during this time period, Congress was debating a new law against lynching, and there had been a fair amount of lynching throughout the South, including in Texas, largely of blacks. There were lynchings of whites, but and lynching, of course, is when a mob just goes out and grabs someone and says, "Oh, we think they're guilty of molesting a child or raping someone or doing something," and they take them out and they kill the person, either by hanging them from a tree or just shooting them. So it has nothing to do with the judicial system. And Congress was going to pass a law to increase the penalties for those engaged in it. However, that law was blocked in Congress by one of the two senators from Texas, Tom Connolly, who filibustered, which meant he just stood up and talked and talked and talked for days about anything, and he had the right to do that. And it basically stopped Congress from working. And in general, the Texas Democrats, which were largely conservative, opposed any federal efforts to extend civil rights to blacks during this period. Now, Roosevelt was getting tired of the critics in his own party from Texas, and so this started to anger the Texas Democratic Party. And then Roosevelt decided unexpectedly to run for a third term of office. Ever since George Washington, presidents had limited themselves to 2 terms in office. In other words, 8 years in office. Even if they were very, very successful, there's nothing in the Constitution about this. It's just that George Washington himself had only served for 2 terms. George Washington was so popular he could have easily been elected to a 3rd term. But he said, no, I think it's good. We have turnover, new people, so 2 terms. And that was sort of the unwritten rule. And then Roosevelt decided he was going to run for a 3rd term. And the problem for Texans was the vice president for the last 8 years had been the Texan Gardner. And he fully expected that he would become president. I mean, he'd been vice president for 8 years. Now he was ready, and he'd been very active and a supporter of Roosevelt, and now he hoped to be the Democratic nominee and win. Well, Gardner was outraged about this, and rather than going out and campaigning for Roosevelt in the election, he went off fishing for several weeks. Well, among the average voter, Roosevelt remained very popular, and that's true, I think, in the United States, because he was a man that most people thought was, well, sympathetic to their plight and trying to do something, and someone who spoke very, very well. And Roosevelt had his very regular weekly radio broadcasts. He called them fireside chats, and he did this over the radio, and he would sit by, they built a fireplace in the White House where he could sit next to it, and there'd be a good photo. And of course, people couldn't see him. And then he was talking on the radio, and he said, well, I'm sitting by my fire, I'm fireside, just like you're at home, and let me, and he talked in a very friendly way. And so people really felt that even though they may be suffering, at least the President of the United States understands them and is trying to do everything possible. But in contrast to the, quote, average person, many, many political and business leaders in Texas were turning away from Roosevelt and the Republican Party. And Roosevelt was not only elected for a 3rd term in 1940, but in 1944 he decided he was going to be president a 4th time. And he argued, well, the United States was engaged in World War II, and so the United States shouldn't change leaders. So he was reelected in 1944, only to die early the next year. But once he died, many, many conservative Texans started questioning their loyalty to the Democratic Party. And we'll see subsequent lectures a shift to the Republican Party. Here, just finally for a few minutes, let's look at a very colorful person who became governor in 1938. And this is Lee O'Daniel, known as Pappy. And there was a Democratic primary in 1938, and they tried to make it as open as possible. Well, this gentleman, who had absolutely zero political experience, decided he wanted to be governor. So he was well known in the state because he had a daily radio show at noon, and he hosted it, and he played in a musical group called the Light Crust Doughboys, or his Hillbilly Blues. And O'Daniel had a small flour company up in the Fort Worth, Dallas area, and he would use the program to advertise his flour and encourage people to buy it to make biscuits. And that's why he was called Pappy, because the show opened with a woman saying, "Pappy, can I have one of your biscuits?" And so, and he really didn't talk at all about specific solutions to Texas's economic problems, but he was just very colorful and a real change. And, I imagine by 1938, people wanted something somewhat lively. The economic depression in general in the United States really only ended because of World War II, increased production. So O'Daniel campaigned and used his radio show to reach out to people, and he traveled throughout the state. And he said, well, my policies, those are easy. My policies are going to be the 10 Commandments as laid out in the Bible, and people would cheer. And my slogan is the golden rule: do as to others as you would have them do to themselves. And people would cheer. And he had huge crowds wherever he went. The professional politicians would just shake their heads and say, "Who is this clown?" Well, O'Daniel really believed that traditional morality would help Texas. And that's why he kept saying, all we got to do is follow those 10 Commandments and the golden rule. He also supported increasing pensions for Texans, and he didn't propose any programs that could be controversial, because he didn't propose anything. So professional politicians were all shocked when O'Daniel received the Democratic nomination. And of course, in Texas at that time, the Democratic candidates always won, and he received incredible 97% of the vote in the general election. Well, O'Daniel became governor, and he asked the state legislature, just as Ma Ferguson done for taxes, said we need increased taxes, otherwise we can't do anything, and the legislature said no. So O'Daniel said, to free up some funds for programs, he cut funding for hospitals, mental asylums, the highway department, and the newly created Department of Public Safety. And O'Daniel also fought with the National Democratic Party, which threatened to reduce funding for Texas. Well, despite having really not done anything other than being colorful and providing entertainment on his radio program, in 1940, O'Daniel ran for re-election. All the newspapers in the country opposed his re-election, but that didn't matter. O'Daniel was popular with the voters. People loved his radio show, and he again won the primary election and the general election. Now, let's just take finally a look at Vice President Garner. He had expected to succeed Roosevelt as president. I mentioned before, thinking that Roosevelt would not seek a third term in office, but Roosevelt did. So, when at the actual national convention, the Texas Democrats there supported Gardner to be the candidate, and they were outvoted, and of course Roosevelt became the candidate. And as a result, both Gardner and O'Daniel, the governor of Texas, refused to support Roosevelt's campaign. Well, Roosevelt was still very, very popular with the average voter in Texas. As I mentioned before, he was very, very personable. He spoke extremely well on the radio. I encourage you, in the module, there's a short video of Roosevelt's inaugural address after he was elected in 1932, became president early the next year. And this video has the first 3 or 4 minutes of his inaugural address, in which he makes the famous statement, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And he really took command, and that's what people wanted at this time. So Roosevelt, despite the prominent Democrats in the state of Texas opposing him, he received 81% of the Texas votes. Okay, and now finally, Governor O'Daniel, he was very surprised, like everyone else, when the U.S. Senator Morris Shepherd died, and O'Daniel wanted to replace him as senator. So O'Daniel put himself up for election as the replacement senator. His opposition within the Democratic Party was Lyndon Baines Johnson, known as LBJ, who, of course, became president in the early 1960s. He was John Kennedy's vice president, and when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson became president. Well, Johnson opposed O'Daniel, and Johnson was a strong supporter of Roosevelt, said the New Deal is the solution. But the conservatives in the state of Texas preferred O'Daniel, and there was a lot of anti-Roosevelt sentiment, so O'Daniel went to the Senate. Well, with O'Daniel leaving the governorship, his lieutenant governor, Coke Stevenson, became governor. And this now is just a few months before, or very shortly before, Pearl Harbor, when the United States enters World War II. And we'll look in the next lecture at Texas during World War II. Thank you very much.